Hey everybody, I am here reading the Church of the East, chapter 5 with you. Syrian Christians of Southwest India. Besides a small remnant of Nestorians in Kurdistan, the only part of the Church of the East that has been able to maintain its distinctive identity until the 20th century is the Syrian church community in the southwest tip of India. They live on or about at the foot of the Western Ghats, G-A-T-S, a range of hills rising to 9,000 feet that form the eastern boundary of the Malabar coast. The people know these Christians by several names. Some call them Syrian Christians because their liturgies and scriptures are in Syriac, and because they gained church members from Syria and Mesopotamia in the early centuries. The Portuguese classed them as Nestorians and called them Christians of the Serra Mountains. They consider them Nestorians because they held the doctrines maintained by the Church of the East. For church jurisdiction, they were subject to the Patriarch of Seleucia. Because they claimed to be the spiritual children of St. Thomas, the Portuguese also called them St. Thomas Christians. According to tradition, St. Thomas landed at an island near Cochin, AD 52. At the time, the island was a flourishing seaport. St. Thomas apparently established 7 churches in the region and ordained clergy for them. He then went to Madras on the eastern tip of India, where the king and all his people turned to Christ. Next, Thomas went to China and spent some time in the city of Peking, called Kambal. In AD 72, he returned to Madras, where the jealous Brahmins provoked the people to stone him to death, and one of them pierced him with a lance. According to the reports, they buried him in Madras, a few miles from St. Thomas's Mount, the place of his martyrdom. His supposed grave is on view in the nave of the Roman Catholic Cathedral at Madras, which was completed in AD 1896. Some of this tradition is surely legendary. The name for Peking shows one inconsistency. Kambal means the emperor's city, but Peking did not become the capital of China until the time of Kublai Khan in the 13th century, well over 1,000 years after St. Thomas visited. Others have questioned St. Thomas's martyrdom at or near St. Thomas's Mount. In any case, it is practically certain that St. Thomas visited both North and South India and spent considerable time there preaching the gospel wherever he went. The mass of tradition, especially that about his stay in the South, is too great to be ignored or lightly passed over. We find the first definite information about the gospel's presence in India toward the close of the 2nd century AD. Certain Indians sent a request to the Bishop of Alexandria to ask that he send someone to instruct them in the doctrine of Christ. Pantanius, a convert to Christ out of Stoic philosophy, offered himself for the task. Stoic philosophy, this is a footnote, was around from about 300 BC to 300 AD. It began in Greece and spread to Rome. The Stoics believed that the world was a unique, finite, intelligent creature whose life was identical to the life of God. This world came about not by chance, but by divine providence, and is the best of all possible worlds despite apparent evil. At periodic intervals, the world becomes a holy creative fire from which an identical world is regenerated. The Stoics emphasized the role of fate. The goal of each human being is to understand the divine plan and to act according to it. This means acting in accord with virtue, which for the Stoics is the only good. The Stoics believed that happiness was achieved by following reason, by freeing themselves from passions, and by concentrating only on things they could control. Okay, so that was a little sub-note there. So going back, it says Pantanius, a convert to Christ, offered himself to the task. He was in the Stoic philosophy and he converted to Christianity. Although some scholars question whether Pantanius actually went to India, the fact seems well established based on the following proof. Pantanius became head of the theological school in Alexandria, and one of his favorite pupils, Clement of Alexandria, speaks of both the yogis of India and also the Brahmins. The latter, he said, were those who obeyed the commandments of Buddha, whom they honor as a god because of his holiness of his life. Where else than in India proper could a traveler from the West have gotten information that would cause him to join Brahmins and Buddhists together in this way? Hinduism, of which the Brahmins are now the chief exponents, did not develop until after AD 600. Reportedly, when Pantanius visited India, Brahmins and Sramans, which are Buddhist ascetics, worked together in close harmony. It was not until 2 or 3 centuries later that they began to draw apart. It seems most likely that Pantanius went to India sometime in the 2nd century. It is said that the inhabitants of the interior of India were converted to Christianity during the reign of Constantine the Great, or soon after. Rufinus, who lived AD 330 to 410, tells the following story. A Christian named Meropius, after he heard about India, desired to go there. So he took his young relatives, Frumentius and Odysseus, and set out. As they were about to return, the local people attacked their ship and killed all on board except Frumentius and Odysseus. They took the youths to the king of the country, who was so pleased with them that he made Frumentius his secretary and Odysseus his cupbearer. Just before his death, he gave them their liberty, but the queen begged them to govern the country until the prince came of age. This they did. While they ruled, they asked whether there were any Christians in the area. When they found out that there were, the youths counseled and encouraged the local Christians as much as possible. Many people who heard their message and saw their example became Christians, and the number increased the whole time that they led the country. When the young king grew up, Frumentius and Odysseus sailed for home. Frumentius proceeded to Alexandria and reported his story to the bishop. The latter begged Frumentius to return to India to minister to the Christians and to try to bring others to know Christ. Frumentius was ordained and returned to India in AD 356. He became a successful minister of the gospel, winning many converts to Christianity. Although Christianity probably obtained a foothold in South India at an early date, the flame of evangelical fervor seems to have flickered quite a bit before AD 345, when the great persecution under Sapor II took place. As a result of the persecution, a new influx of Christian life and activity came to India. Thereafter, the Christians in South India became such a force that kings and rulers were ready to confer special privileges on them in order to secure the favor and support of such an influential body. So they wanted, to be nice to the Christians because they wanted their support. Cosmas mentioned many Christians after his visit to India in AD 522. The next event in South India was where more refugees arrived from the West in the latter part of the 8th century. 50 years later, another group of refugees. When these last groups came to India, the Christians of Southwest India were already an important community, socially and politically. Neil says that the Indians ranked the Christians next to the royal family, allowed them to ride on elephants, and placed them on terms of equality with the Nairs next to Brahmins, the highest caste in that part of India. Remember, the caste system is levels of class that you're born into in India, and you often can't move from your caste. So if you're born into the lower class, you stay there. If you're born in the elite, you stay there, etc. Their bishops governed them in matters of the state and the church. However, as they prospered financially, their spiritual and missionary fervor diminished proportionately, but more on the decline shortly. In the early days, the heathen rulers did not merely tolerate the Christians, but encouraged and honored them. Obviously, they were neither vicious nor disaffected characters. Rather, a description of the state of the church when the Portuguese arrived in 1500 probably applies with equal truth to the 9th century. The Christians, Neil says, were easily distinguished from the others by their superior grace. Although divided into northern and southern sections, the Christians of Southwest India were on good terms. The people recognized them for their industry and natural ability, their elegance of their diction, and their respect for parents, elders, and clergy. The men were always armed, but quarrels were few and murders non-existent. They were generally rich with a considerable number of slaves, whom they treated with the utmost kindness and consideration. They were often employed as merchants, and their honor and kindness were acknowledged by all. These Christians were moderate and lived almost entirely on rice and milk, seldom tasting either meat or wine. They did not use images, but held the cross in great veneration. So they didn't have idols, but they revered the cross. They were devout in their Sabbath attendance and at communion, but did so out of joy, not as a matter of obligation. The church allowed the priests to marry and distinguish their wives by a silver or gold cross worn around their neck. Unfortunately, as time went by and the people recognized them as separate and superior caste, these Christians started to imitate their Hindu neighbors in regard to such matters as diet, avoidance of pollution, etc. And so they basically started to, what's the word? I just drew a blank on the word, but the Christians started to compromise. That's the word I was thinking. And it started to affect how people viewed them. As the church became weak and sluggish, it lost any sort of missionary force. Then Shiva worship through the preaching of Manickavasakar began. Shiva is one of two leading gods of Hinduism. And so it's a type of worship. For the next 500 years, the history of the Syrians of Southwest India is practically a blank. In the 13th century, John de Monte Corvino visited India and baptized a number of people. Over 100 years later, Jordanus, a Dominican, arrived and remained for some time. And in his book, he describes his mission and the hardships he and his party endured, not from the Eastern Christians who received them kindly, but from the Muslims who opposed them and even killed some of them. The Portuguese arrived in India in AD 1500. They burned all records of the St. Thomas congregations, which they regarded as heretical. Franciscan brothers came with the Portuguese and founded a church in Malabar under the care of 4 Eastern Church bishops, and it seems that the Franciscans did not cause much trouble for the existing church, and for 50 years there is no record of any difficulties between the two bodies. It was different, however, when the Jesuits came in AD 1542. 9 years later, under pressure from the Portuguese king, the Portuguese governors began to pressure the Syrian Christians to accept Roman Catholic doctrine and practice. They compelled the native princes to persecute the Christians with confiscation and imprisonment, among other hardships. The harshness of the Portuguese, however, failed to achieve their purpose completely. Besides persecution, they also sought to cut off the bishops who came from Persia, either by killing them or imprisoning them for life. Let's see. Okay, so the council considered those who submitted as Roman Catholics. So a lot of them submitted, at least nominally, to the headship of Rome. How many persons this council represented is unknown, but 30,000 refused to abandon the errors of the Nestorius or to submit to the one Catholic Apostolic Church. Okay, then in 1653, the Dutch defeated the Portuguese, and these Roman Catholics met at the Koenenkroos in Cochin, where they renounced their allegiance to the Portuguese and pledged themselves never again to acknowledge Portuguese bishops. Out of a total of 200,000 persons, only 400, and they're not sure if that was individuals or families, remained true to the Roman Catholicism. So there was a shift now away from Catholicism back to Protestantism. In AD 1657, the Pope sent a Carmelite bishop and several priests to take the place of the Jesuits, hoping to reverse the results of the revolt. Under the Carmelite persuasion, 84 churches out of 116 returned to Roman Catholicism. The outcome was a once unified church divided 3 ways. One part composed of those who refused to join the Catholic Church, a second part composed of those who converted to Roman Catholicism and then disavowed under the Dutch, and the third part composed of those who converted, reverted, and reconverted again. So we've got a whole mixture of Catholicism, Protestantism breaks. Although the Dutch took Cochin in AD 1653, the Portuguese still retained Goa, G-O-A, another area on the Malabar coast. And with Goa as their headquarters, they were able to prevent interactions by sea between the Nestorian Christians of the Malabar coast and the Patriarch of Babylon. In AD 1780, the Portuguese cruelly persecuted the Christians and compelled many new converts to return to their former heathen practices. To escape the persecution, 20,000 Christians left their homes and took refuge in the hills. Later that century, in AD 1796, the Roman Catholic theologian Paoli said that there were 64 Nestorian and 32 Jacobite churches on the Malabar coast, but the total number of people is unknown. 10 years later, 1806, Dr. Claudius Buchanan visited Malabar. He found the doctrines of the Syrians pure and essentially in agreement with the Church of England, though few in number. Yet physically, he perceived all around symptoms of poverty and political depression. And this has a little note about the Jacobites. They were I don't know what this word is, but they believed that Christ had only one nature, a composite nature of both human and divine. The opposite is diophysite. So there's monophysites and diophysites. The belief that Christ had 2 natures, one human, one divine. Okay. Their time on trial, however, was not yet over. In AD 1809, they suffered more persecution as the Portuguese butchered 9 priests and almost of 3,000 men, women, and children. It's a typo there. Threw their bodies into the backwaters. In AD 1816, Bishop Middleton visited the same area, and he wrote in direct contrast to Dr. Buchanan that the Syrians acknowledged 7 sacraments, worshipped the Virgin Mary, whom they hailed as a mother of God, and had auricular confession and solitary masses, which were among the most valued privileges of the clergy, although the ordinary layfolk knew little of their religion. What a contradiction! Why should the Nestorian Church, after maintaining pure doctrine for so long, suddenly switch to be a Roman Catholic community? 2 options are possible. The easier answer is that perhaps the people with whom Dr. Buchanan spoke were mostly members of the Church of the East, while those with whom Bishop Middleton met were mostly Jacobites. Or it may be that as a result of the terrible persecution of AD 1809, the leading members of the Eastern Church community and many of their clergy sealed their testimony with their blood. Left without leaders, the spiritual life of the laymen may have deteriorated, so they found it comparably easy to accept such form of worship and doctrinal beliefs as those held and practiced by the Jacobites and the Roman Catholics. In the census of AD 1911, the Nestorians numbered 12,155. In 1928, they numbered at least 10,000. So somewhere around 10,000 are still there now, these Syrian Christians of Southwest India. And that's the end of chapter 5.